The crack of a whip was the first sound a gunshot across the bleached canvas of the sky. The second was the splintering of wood as the stagecoach lurched, a lead ball tearing a chunk from the driver's box. Dust and chaos erupted on the trail. 3 riders' bandanas masking their faces spurred their horses from the cover of a rocky outcrop, their whoops and hollers swallowed by the pounding of hooves. Inside the world became a violent shudder. Jedediah Stone was thrown against the worn leather of the opposite seat, his hat knocked to the floor. The other 2 passengers, a portly man in a sweat-stained suit and his pale, trembling wife, cried out in alarm. Jedediah said nothing. He simply braced himself, his body moving with a grim, practiced economy that defied the pandemonium. His eyes, the color of slate under a stormy sky, were already scanning, assessing. "They're stopping us," the portly man wheezed, fumbling inside his coat. "Stay down." Jedediah's voice was a low growl, rough as granite. It was not a suggestion. The coach ground to a halt in a cloud of alkali dust. Shouts echoed from outside, coarse and demanding. Jedediah's hand moved not toward the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, but to his worn saddlebag on the floor. His fingers closed around the cold, heavy stock of a sawed-off shotgun. He had hoped he wouldn't need it. Hope he'd learned long ago was a fool's currency. One of the bandits wrenched open the door. "All right, folks, wallets, watches, and jewels. Hand 'em over nice and slow." Jedediah moved faster than slow. As the masked man's gaze fell on the woman's pearl necklace, Jedediah brought the shotgun up. It wasn't a flashy draw. It was a brutal, efficient motion. The twin barrels filled the bandit's vision. There was a moment of frozen surprise, a widening of the eyes above the bandana. Then the world exploded in a deafening roar. The force of the blast threw the man backward, a ragged scarecrow tumbling into the dust. Before the echoes faded, Jedediah was out of the coach, using the door as a shield. The second rider, startled, was already turning his horse, raising his pistol. Jedediah's Colt was in his hand now, the movement a blur. He drew, fired. The man fell. It was not the work of a hero. It was the cold, precise work of a man who knew the geometry of death. The third rider, seeing his companions dispatched in seconds, hesitated. It was his final mistake. Jedediah aimed not for the man, but for the horse. The animal screamed and reared, throwing its rider hard against the unforgiving earth. The man lay still. Silence descended, broken only by the whimpering of the woman inside the coach and the panicked breathing of the horses. The dust began to settle, revealing the stark tableau under the scorching sun. Jedediah stood over the last man, his pistol still smoking. He felt nothing. Not triumph, not relief. Only a familiar, hollow ache. As he holstered his weapon, his coat shifted. A thin silver chain slipped from his pocket, and a small oval locket clattered onto the rocky ground. It popped open on impact, revealing a miniature hand-tinted portrait. On one side, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. On the other, a small boy, barely a toddler, his face a perfect blend of hers and his own. Jedediah froze. The image struck him like a physical blow, and for a fleeting second, the dusty trail dissolved. He was somewhere else, somewhere green and full of laughter. He could smell wood smoke, and Sarah's lilac soap, could feel the impossible weight of his son Daniel sleeping on his chest. A memory so sharp, so painful, it stole the air from his lungs. Then just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the scent of gunpowder and the coppery tang of blood. His hand trembled as he reached down and scooped up the locket, snapping it shut with a final metallic click. He shoved it deep into his pocket, a secret shame, a wound that would not heal. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled old man with a new lease on life, climbed down from his seat. "Mister," he stammered, his eyes wide. "I ain't never seen shooting like that." You some kind of lawman? No, Jedediah said, his voice flat. He turned and climbed back onto the coach, leaving the driver to deal with the aftermath. He was just a passenger. A man trying and failing to outrun the ghosts that rode at his back. Hours later, the stagecoach crested a low rise, and the town of Redemption Creek came into view. It was less a town and more a collection of weathered buildings clinging to life in the shadow of a vast, arid valley. Splintered boardwalks lined a single wide street of packed dirt. The windows of the general store and saloon were caked with a permanent layer of dust. The rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer was a lonely metallic heartbeat in the oppressive quiet. It was a place gasping for air, and Jedediah could see why. Good. Perched on a hill overlooking the town like a vulture was a grand two-story mansion. Its whitewashed walls seemed to mock the sun-bleached gray of the buildings below. It was a monument to power, an anchor of stone and glass, holding the entire valley in its oppressive shadow. The stage pulled up in front of the livery. As Jedediah stepped out, stretching his stiff limbs, he saw her. She was standing by a water trough, helping a tired-looking older man fill a pair of barrels on the back of a buckboard. She was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with sun-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical braid. Her dress was faded but clean, and she moved with a quiet determination that seemed at odds with the town's defeated air. When she looked up, her eyes, a startling clear blue, met his for a moment. There was no curiosity in her gaze, only a deep, weary caution. The portly man from the coach hurried over to Jedediah, pressing a few coins into his hand. "For your trouble, sir. My wife and I are eternally grateful." Jedediah looked at the coins, then back at the girl and her father as they guided their weary horse down the street. Their farm was likely one of the many small ranches struggling under the weight of whatever power resided in that house on the hill. He closed his fist around the coins. Trouble, it seemed, had a way of finding a man, whether he was looking for it or not. And Redemption Creek felt like a town overflowing with it. Jedediah took a room at the town's only boarding house, a modest establishment run by a widow named Martha, whose face was a roadmap of hard years. From his second-story window, he had a clear view of the street and the mansion on the hill. He learned the landowner's name soon enough: Silas Kane. The name was spoken in hushed tones at the saloon, a mix of fear and resentful awe. Kane owned the bank, the largest tracts of land, and most importantly, the water rights. In this parched country, that meant he owned everything. He saw the girl from the livery again the next day. She was in the general store, her father beside her. Jedediah watched as the storekeeper, a man with nervous, darting eyes, shook his head apologetically. "I'm sorry, Thomas," the storekeeper said, his voice low but audible. "Credit's been cut. Mr. Kane's orders." The girl's father, Thomas May, slumped. He was a stoop-shouldered man, his skin weathered like old leather, his hands gnarled from a lifetime of work. "But the blight, we lost half the crop. We just need seed for the next planting." "My hands are tied," the storekeeper mumbled, refusing to meet his eyes. The girl, however, stood straight. "It's not right, Mr. Gable. We've traded here for 20 years. Her voice was steady, laced with a steel that her father seemed to have lost. "This is Mr. Kane's town now," Eliza Gable replied, his gaze flickering toward the door, as if expecting Kane himself to materialize. "His rules." Eliza May. The name suited her. It had a simple, sturdy elegance. She turned her jaw set and led her father out of the store, their meager supplies left on the counter. Jedediah bought a sack of flour and some coffee, then followed them out into the blinding sunlight. He caught up to them near their buckboard. "Mr. May," he said, his voice startling them both. Thomas flinched, but Eliza simply turned to face him, her expression guarded. "We don't know you, mister," she said. "Name's Jedediah Stone. He held out the sack of flour. Heard you were in a tight spot. This might help. Thomas May looked at the flour with the desperate eyes of a starving man. But Eliza stepped slightly in front of him. We don't take charity. It's not charity, Jedediah said gruffly. Call it a loan. Pay me back when you can. She studied his face, her blue eyes, searching for a trick, a hidden price. She saw only a tired man with shadows in his eyes. After a long moment, she nodded curtly. Thank you, Mr. Stone. She took the sack its weight, a small but significant victory. What does Cain want with your land? Jedediah asked, his gaze drifting up toward the mansion. Thomas sighed, a sound of utter defeat. The same thing he wants with everyone's. Everything. He's been buying up the small ranches one by one. Chokes off their water, cuts their credit, and waits for them to break. We're the last ones holding out on this side of the valley. Why? Eliza answered, her voice bitter. Because it's our home. My mother is buried there. She paused, then added, and because Silas Cain doesn't just want the land. He enjoys the breaking. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Jedediah sat on the boarding house porch cleaning his Colt. The methodical ritual, the scent of oil, the click of the cylinder, the cool weight of the steel was a familiar comfort. He saw a buggy pull up to the May Ranch on the edge of town. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped out. Silas Cain. Even from a distance, Cain carried an air of theatrical authority. He moved with a languid grace, his posture unbent by the harshness of the land he sought to conquer. He spoke with Thomas May on the porch of their small weathered cabin for a long time. Jedediah couldn't hear the words, but he could read the story in their bodies. Cain calm and expansive. Thomas, shrinking his shoulders, bowed under an invisible weight. Eliza stood in the doorway, a rigid silhouette against the lamplight. When Cain finally left, Thomas stumbled back inside. A moment later, the sound of a single heartbroken sob carried on the evening air. Jedediah reassembled his pistol. He had come to Redemption Creek for peace, for a place to bury his past. Instead, he'd found a town caught in a quiet war and a family on the verge of losing everything. The ghosts of his own past stirred restlessly. He knew what it was to lose a home. He knew the cost of standing by and doing nothing. The next day, 2 of Cain's men paid the Mize a visit. They weren't negotiators. They were large, brutish men with cruel mouths and heavy fists. Jedediah saw their horses tied to the fence and started walking. He arrived just as one of the men backhanded Thomas across the face, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Eliza rushed forward, grabbing a pitchfork, her face a mask of fury. Get off our land, she cried. The second man laughed, a nasty grating sound. Mr. Cain just wants to make sure your father understands his very generous offer. Maybe you need some convincing, little lady. He reached for her. That's when Jedediah spoke. I'd advise against that. The 2 men turned. They saw a stranger lean and weathered, his hands empty at his sides. They sized him up and dismissed him. This ain't your business, old man, the first one snarled, rubbing his knuckles. You're threatening a man, and his daughter Jedediah said, his voice still level, almost conversational. That makes it my business. The thug lunged. Jedediah didn't draw his gun. He moved with a blinding speed that belied his weary demeanor. He sidestepped the punch, grabbed the man's arm, and used his momentum to throw him face first into the side of the buckboard. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. The second man, stunned, reached for his gun, but Jedediah was already on him. A swift, brutal strike to the throat, followed by a knee to the gut, left the man gasping on the ground, his pistol unfired. Jedediah stood over them, his chest rising and falling evenly. He hadn't even broken a sweat. He looked at his hands and then flexed them slowly, a flicker of self-loathing in his eyes. This was the man he was trying to leave behind. The violence came too easily. It was a part of him etched into his very soul. Eliza stared at him, and the pitchfork lowered her breath, coming in ragged gasps. Her fear of the thugs had been replaced by a new, more complex emotion as she looked at him. Awe, confusion, and a different kind of fear. Jedediah turned to the men groaning in the dirt. "Go back to Cain. Tell him the May family has a new hired hand, and tell him to send someone who knows how to fight next time." He then looked at Thomas, who was picking himself up, and then at Eliza. "Trouble's not just coming anymore," he said, his voice heavy. "It's here." In the days that followed, an unspoken alliance formed between Jedediah Stone and the May family. He moved his belongings from the boarding house to their small, drafty barn, claiming the loft as his own. He never spoke of payment, and they, knowing they had nothing to offer, never asked. His presence was a silent declaration of defiance, a stony bulwark against the tide of Silas Cain's ambition. He worked alongside Thomas from sunup to sundown, his hands, more accustomed to the cold steel of a pistol, relearning the rhythms of the earth. He mended fences, cleared stubborn rocks from the fields, and reinforced the weakening walls of the barn. The physical labor was a welcome penance, a way to exhaust his body, so his mind wouldn't have time to wander down the dark, familiar pathways of memory. But it was his interactions with Eliza that began to chip away at the fortress he had built around his heart. She worked as tirelessly as any man, her quiet strength a constant, humbling presence. They often worked in silence, a comfortable quiet that needed no words. He watched her gentle the horses, her touch firm but kind, and saw in it a resilience that Cain's pressure had failed to break. One afternoon, while they were repairing a section of corral fence, she finally broke the silence that held his past captive. "You're not a farmhand, Mr. Stone," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. He kept his eyes on the post he was setting. "I am now. Those men, you handled them like you've done it 100 times before." Her voice was soft, devoid of judgment. "Who are you running from?" Jedediah stopped his work, the rammer held loosely in his hands. He looked out across the valley toward the distant, hazy mountains. "Myself, mostly." The answer hung in the air between them, honest and stark. Eliza didn't press further. Instead, she changed the subject, her tone becoming more practical. "My father says Cain is trying to dam the creek upstream. If he does, our well will be dry in a month." "He won't," Jedediah said with a certainty that surprised her. "A dam takes time. He's impatient. He'll make another move before then." His prediction proved true. A few nights later, they awoke to the smell of smoke. A fire had been set in their northern pasture, the dry grass burning with terrifying speed toward the barn. While Thomas and a few sympathetic neighbors formed a bucket brigade from the well, Jedediah moved with a different purpose. He saddled his horse, his face grim in the flickering firelight. "Where are you going?" Eliza cried, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with fear. "To send a message," he said, swinging into the saddle. He rode hard, not toward the fire, but around it, circling toward the low hills where Cain's largest herds grazed. He found them easily, a sea of dark shapes under the moonlight. He fired 2 shots into the air. The cattle, already spooked by the distant glow and smell of smoke, stampeded. He expertly guided the terrified herd not toward town, but straight toward the meticulously manicured lawns surrounding Cain's mansion. The next morning, Silas Cain surveyed the ruin of his prize-winning gardens and the splintered remains of his white picket fence. His fury was a cold, quiet thing. He knew who was responsible. This was no longer a simple matter of acquiring land. It had become a contest of wills, He sent the town's sheriff, a man named Cobb, whose loyalty was bought and paid for, to the May Ranch. Cobb was a paunchy, sweating man who tried to project authority he didn't possess. Stone Cobb blustered, gesturing with a thumb toward Jedediah. "Silas Kane wants a word with you. Says you caused him some property damage last night." "Did he file a complaint?" Jedediah asked calmly, not bothering to stop his work sharpening an axe blade. "Well, no, not officially, but—" "Then there's nothing to talk about." Eliza, who had been watching from the porch, stepped forward. "Sheriff, if Mr. Kane has a problem, perhaps he should be a man and address it himself instead of sending his lapdog." Cobb's face flushed a deep mottled red. He opened his mouth to retort, but the look in Jedediah's eyes, a flat, deadly calm, made him reconsider. He turned and retreated his bluster, deflating with every step. After he was gone, Eliza turned to Jedediah, a faint wry smile touching her lips. "You enjoy making him angry, don't you?" "He's a bully," Jedediah said, testing the edge of the axe. "Bullies only understand one thing." That afternoon, he found her practicing with her father's old rifle, propping it awkwardly against a fence post. Her shots were wild, kicking up dust, far from the tin can she'd set on a rock. He walked up behind her. "You're pulling, not squeezing." She jumped, startled. "I didn't hear you." "You're anticipating the kick," he said, his voice softening slightly. He moved closer, his presence large and solid behind her. "Here. Let me show you." He placed a hand over hers on the stock, his other hand guiding her arm to steady the barrel. "Breathe out slow. Squeeze the trigger on the exhale. Don't jerk it." His closeness was unnerving and comforting all at once. She could feel the warmth of his body, smell the faint scent of leather and dust that clung to him. Her heart beat a little faster. She did as he said, breathing out, her fingers slowly tightening on the trigger. The rifle fired the kick less jarring than before. The tin can flew off the rock. A genuine smile, bright and unguarded, lit up her face. "I did it." "You did," he confirmed. Their hands were still touching. A current of unspoken energy passed between them, a moment of charged silence in the vast, empty landscape. He pulled his hand away first, the gruff mask sliding back into place. But the moment lingered. A fragile bond forged in shared struggle and quiet understanding was growing stronger. Later that week, Jedediah rode into town for supplies. As he passed the saloon, he saw a poster nailed to the wall. It was a wanted poster, old and weathered, the sketch barely recognizable. But he recognized the name Jedediah Stone, wanted for robbery and murder in the territory of New Mexico. The price on his head was substantial. He stared at it for a long moment, the past reaching out to reclaim him. He tore it down, crumpling it in his fist. But he knew it was only a matter of time before someone else recognized him. His investigation into Kane took him to the county records office in the next town over. He spent a day poring over dusty ledgers and property deeds. He found what he was looking for, but it wasn't what he expected. Kane wasn't just buying land. He was buying specific parcels, all adjoining, all leading to one particular plot, the May Ranch. There was no gold there, no oil, no reason for such a singular obsession. Unless the value wasn't in the ground, unless it was in the past. He found an old property map, one from nearly a decade ago. He traced the lines with his finger until he found the plot of land that was now the May Ranch. His breath caught in his throat. The name listed on the deed was not May. It was Stone. Jedediah stumbled back from the table, the dusty room closing in on him. This wasn't just any piece of land. This was his land. The place where he had built a cabin with his own 2 hands, where his wife Sarah had planted a garden, where his son Daniel had taken his first steps, the place where they had both died. He raced back to Redemption Creek, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and dawning horror. He went straight to the mansion on the hill. He didn't bother with the door. He kicked it in. Silas Kane was in his study, a cavernous room lined with books he'd likely never read. He was standing by the window, looking down at the valley, a glass of brandy in his hand. He didn't seem surprised to see Jedediah. He turned slowly, a look of melancholic triumph on his face. "I was wondering when you would finally piece it together." Jedediah Kane said, his voice smooth and cold. "Welcome home." Jedediah's hand was on his Colt. Why Kane? Why this land? Kane swirled the brandy in his glass, his expression unreadable. "This land is not about resources, Jedediah. It's about memory. It's about justice." He took a sip, his eyes locking with Jedediah's. "You see, you didn't just lose a wife in that fire. I lost a sister. Sarah was my wife's sister." The words hit Jedediah like a physical blow. He had never known. Sarah rarely spoke of her family back east. "My sweet Eleanor Kane," continued his voice, taking on a theatrical, sorrowful tremor. She adored her sister. When news came of the fire of Sarah and the boy's death, it broke her. She wasted away, died of a broken heart a year later, cursing your name. "It was an accident," Jedediah choked out, the old familiar guilt clawing at his throat. A lamp overturned. "An accident?" Kane scoffed, his voice turning sharp. "You were a gunslinger, a man who made his living in blood and violence. You brought trouble to your own doorstep. You had enemies, did you not? Recklessness is not an accident, Jedediah. It is a choice. You chose your life, and in doing so you destroyed two families. Mine and yours." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Kane's obsession, his relentless campaign against the Mize, it was all a twisted monument to his grief. He wasn't trying to build an empire. He was trying to exorcise a ghost. "I want this land," Kane said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, filled with a chilling fanaticism. "I will take it back from the ashes you created. I will build a new legacy here, a testament to what was lost. A legacy of stone to replace the one you left in cinders. The Mize are simply the last obstacle. And you? You are a ghost who has inconveniently returned to his own haunting." Jedediah stood frozen in the center of the opulent room, the truth a more crippling blow than any bullet. This was not a fight for land. It was a personal vendetta, a war of ghosts and grief. And Silas Kane, the man he thought was a simple tyrant, was a victim of the same fire that had consumed Jedediah's own life. The enemy was not the man in front of him. The enemy was the past, and it had finally caught up to them both. The revelation in Kane's study left Jedediah adrift in a sea of resurfaced grief. He had carried the guilt of the fire for 8 long years, a weight that had shaped the hollow man he had become. He'd always believed it was his fault, a stray spark from the hearth, an overturned lamp in his absence. Kane's version that Jed's life as a gunslinger had invited the danger felt horrifically plausible. It didn't absolve him. It merely changed the nature of his sin from carelessness to recklessness. He returned to the May Ranch, a changed man. The righteous anger that had fueled him was gone, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. Eliza saw it the moment he rode in. The stony resolve in his eyes had been replaced by a familiar, haunted look, deeper than she'd ever seen it before. "What happened?" she asked, meeting him by the barn. He couldn't bring himself to tell her the whole truth. How could he explain that the land she was fighting for was the graveyard of his own family, the epicenter of a tragedy that now ensnared them all? "Kane's reasons are personal," he said, his voice raspy. "This isn't about water rights, Eliza. It's about revenge." The word hung in the air, cold and sharp. Eliza's face hardened. Revenge for what? Something that happened a long time ago. He evaded turning to unsaddle his horse. Something I was a part of. His evasiveness created a new, unwelcome distance between them. The easy trust they had started to build now felt fragile. He retreated into himself, the silence he now wore like a shroud, heavier than before. He spent his hours working with a feverish intensity, pushing his body to its limits. But his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the smoking ruins of his past. Cain, meanwhile, became more unhinged. Now that his obsession was laid bare, his methods grew more desperate. He could no longer hide behind the pretense of business. He saw Jedediah not as a hired hand, but as the ghost of his own pain, and he was determined to exorcise him. He began by turning the town completely against the Mize. He called in every debt threatening foreclosure on anyone who even spoke to them. The few neighbors who had helped with the fire now crossed the street to avoid them. Redemption Creek became a town of averted eyes and whispered condemnations. The Mays were utterly isolated, an island of defiance in a sea of fear. One evening, Jedediah found Eliza by the small fenced-off plot behind the cabin. Two simple wooden crosses stood there. One marked the grave of her mother. The other, a much smaller one, was for a baby brother who had died in infancy. She was tending the wildflowers that grew there, her movements slow and deliberate. "He wants to erase this," she said without turning around. "All of it. My mother's memory, our home. It's not enough for him to own the land. He has to own the story of it too." She finally looked at him, her blue eyes pleading for an answer he didn't have. "Hope is a luxury, Mr. Stone. We trade in survival. But I don't know how much longer we can survive this." Her words cut through his own self-pity. He saw not just her weariness, but her unyielding spirit. She was fighting for her home, for her family's legacy, with a purity of purpose he had long since lost. He had been so consumed by his own ghosts that he'd forgotten the living people who stood beside him. "You won't have to," he said, the old resolve slowly returning to his voice. "I won't let him win." But Cain's next move was more direct and far more cruel. The following afternoon, Eliza rode into town to try and barter for medicine for her ailing father. She didn't return. As dusk settled, Thomas May grew frantic. Jedediah knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone where she was. He rode to the mansion, but this time he didn't storm the front door. He circled around the back, moving through the shadows like a wraith. He found her in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with exotic wilting plants. Cain was there, seated at a grand piano, playing a sorrowful, discordant melody. Eliza stood by the far wall, a prisoner in a glass cage. Two of Cain's men stood guard at the door. Cain stopped playing as Jedediah entered, a gun in each hand. The music lingered in the air like a bad memory. "I knew you would come." Cain said, his tone one of weary satisfaction. "A man will always come for the thing he cannot bear to lose. I learned that lesson a long time ago." "Let her go, Cain," Jedediah said, his voice dangerously low. "All you have to do is leave," Cain countered, rising from the piano bench. "Sign over any claim you might think you have to that land. Renounce it. Ride out of this valley and never return. Disappear like the ghost you are. Do that, and she and her father can live out their simple lives in peace." Eliza looked at Jedediah, her eyes filled with a terrifying mix of fear and defiance. "Don't do it, Jed," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Don't let him win." It was a trap, and they all knew it. Cain would never let them go. He was a man drowning in his own grief, and he intended to pull everyone else down with him. "This is between you and me." Jedediah said, his gaze locked on Cain. It always has been, Cain agreed. He nodded to his men. But the final act of this little tragedy will not be staged here. It deserves a more fitting venue. He looked at Jedediah, a strange feverish light in his eyes. Meet me at dawn, at the cabin. Come alone. We will finish this on the ground where it all began. Before Jedediah could react, Cain's men grabbed Eliza. One held a knife to her throat. At dawn, Jedediah Cain repeated, "Or she will pay the price for your past, just as my Eleanor did." They dragged her away, leaving Jedediah alone in the suffocating silence of the conservatory. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up, howling around the corners of the mansion. A storm was coming, a storm of dust and memory and blood. And it was heading for the one place on earth he never wanted to see again. The wind was a living thing, a malevolent spirit that scoured the land with sand and fury. It tore at Jedediah's clothes and stung his eyes as he rode toward the skeleton of his former life. The sky was a churning cauldron of brown and gray, the sun a pale, forgotten coin. Visibility was shrinking by the minute, the world reduced to a maelstrom of howling wind and stinging dust. It was the perfect backdrop for a reckoning. He saw the ruins of the cabin materialize out of the haze, a jagged silhouette against the storm. The chimney stood like a broken tombstone, at the only part of the structure that had survived the inferno. The rest was just a foundation of scorched stones, a scar on the earth that time had not healed. This was where his world had ended. Cain was waiting, his dark coat whipping in the wind. He stood near the chimney holding a lantern whose frantic flame cast an eerie dancing glow. Eliza was beside him, her hands bound, her face pale but resolute. One of Cain's men stood a few paces away, a rifle held loosely in his hands. "You came." Cain's voice was thin against the roar of the storm. "I knew you would. A man can never truly abandon his own grave." "This is over, Cain," Jedediah shouted, dismounting from his horse, his own hand hovering over the butt of his colt. "Let her go?" Over Cain let out a dry, rattling laugh that was quickly stolen by the wind. "It will be over when your memory is wiped from this land, when my monument to Eleanor stands where your failure now rots." The sandstorm intensified, the world dissolving into a suffocating vortex. Jedediah could barely see 10 feet in front of him. The lantern was a lone, flickering star in the brown chaos. He could hear the ticking of his own pocket watch, a frantic, metallic heartbeat against the primal scream of the wind. "You blame me for your wife's death," Jedediah yelled, his words torn from his lips. "Maybe you're right. Maybe my past brought this down on us all. But Eliza has nothing to do with it. She is standing on hallowed ground." Cain shrieked, his composure finally cracking, revealing the raw grief beneath. "She is an interloper in my shrine of sorrow." He shoved Eliza forward toward the crumbling foundation. "This is where my sister died. This is where her son burned." In that moment, a subtle shift occurred in Cain's henchmen. The man looked uneasy, his eyes darting between Cain's frantic form and the swirling dust. He was a hired gun, not a participant in a madman's ritual. Jedediah saw his opening. "You think this will bring you peace? Cain building on top of graves. It will only bury you with them." "It is all I have left." As Cain's attention was fixed on Jedediah, Eliza acted. With a surge of desperate strength, she drove her shoulder hard into Cain's side, throwing him off balance. He stumbled, the lantern falling from his grasp and extinguishing, plunging them into the storm's murky twilight. The henchman, startled, raised his rifle. Jedediah drew his Colt, the motion instinctual fluid. A single shot cracked through the howl of the wind. The henchman grunted and fell, his rifle clattering against the stones. Kane scrambled back to his feet, pulling a pistol from his coat. He grabbed Eliza, holding her in front of him as a shield. His face, illuminated by a sudden flash of distant lightning, was a mask of utter desperation. "You see, Stone?" he screamed over the storm. "Violence is all you know. It follows you. It's what killed them. It's what killed my Eleanor." No, a voice cut through the gale. It was Eliza. She was looking not at Jedediah, but at Kane, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. No, it wasn't him. "What are you talking about?" Girl, Kane snarled, tightening his grip. "The fire," she gasped, her voice trembling. "My father. He told me stories. The family who lived here before us. He said they died in a fire, but it wasn't an accident. It was the Black Creek Gang. They bragged about it in a saloon years ago. They were looking for the man who lived here. A gunslinger who'd betrayed them, taken a share of their loot. They said they set the fire to teach him a lesson, to burn his whole world to the ground. The world stopped spinning. The roar of the wind faded to a dull hum in Jedediah's ears. The Black Creek Gang, a name from a life he'd fought to forget. He had run with them for a short time before their methods grew too savage, too cruel. He'd left taking his share and disappearing thinking he'd gotten away clean. He hadn't betrayed them. He'd just left. But to men like that, leaving was the same as betrayal. He looked at Kane, and for the first time, he saw not a villain, but another victim, a man consumed by a lie. Kane stared at Eliza, his mind refusing to process her words. No, he was reckless. His life, his choices. "They set the fire," Kane Jedediah said, his voice cracking with the weight of a truth he had never known. "They murdered my family, and they framed me for it." The foundation of Silas Kane's world, the very bedrock of his grief and hatred, crumbled in that instant. His entire crusade, his all-consuming revenge, was built on a fiction. He was not an avenger. He was just another man, broken by the same senseless violence that had shattered Jedediah. His grip on Eliza slackened. The gun in his hand felt heavy, pointless. His eyes, wild with madness, only moments before, were now hollow, vacant pools of despair. He looked at the scorched stones at his feet, at the ghost of a home, and saw nothing but the ruin of his own life. The sandstorm raged on, but the battle was over. There was no enemy left to fight. There were only 3 people lost in a storm of grief, standing on the ashes of a shared terrible past. As the wind began to die, so too did the fire in Silas Kane. The truth had not set him free. It had hollowed him out, leaving an emptiness that his years of cultivated hatred could no longer fill. He dropped the pistol. It landed with a soft thud in the accumulated dust. He sank to his knees amidst the ruins of Jedediah's home, a man utterly broken. Jedediah cut the ropes from Eliza's wrists. Her skin was chafed and red, but she met his gaze with a look of profound, sorrowful understanding. There was no triumph in this victory, only a vast shared pain. When Sheriff Cobb and a small, hesitant posse arrived, drawn by the sound of the gunshot, they found a strange and somber scene. Kane's henchman lay dead. Kane himself was on his knees, staring into nothing, muttering his dead wife's name over and over. He offered no resistance as Cobb, with a newfound and shaky authority, placed him under arrest. The tragic downfall of the town's tyrant was not a spectacle of justice, but a quiet, pathetic collapse. The journey back to Redemption Creek was silent. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean, and the sky a tender, bruised blue. The town, emerging from the dust, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The oppressive shadow of the mansion on the hill had finally begun to recede. In the days that followed, the story unspooled. Eliza's testimony, combined with Cain's complete mental breakdown, painted a clear picture. The town learned of the vendetta, of the shared tragedy that had fueled a decade of quiet oppression. There was no celebration, only a sober reckoning with the years of fear they had endured. With Cain's assets frozen and his influence shattered, the town slowly began to find its own footing. Credit was restored at the general store. Water flowed freely down the creek. People began to speak to the Mize again, and their greetings tinged with respect and a measure of shame for their previous cowardice. Jedediah helped Thomas May secure the deed to their ranch, the paperwork a formality now that Cain's claim was null and void. The land was officially theirs, free and clear. But for Jedediah, it would always be haunted ground. A week after the storm, he knew he had to return one last time. Eliza insisted on coming with him. They rode together not as employer and hired hand, but as two people bound by a shared ordeal. The ruins looked different in the clear morning light. Less menacing, more like a quiet place of rest. Jedediah walked to the spot where the front porch had been the place where he had so often sat with Sarah, watching Daniel play in the yard. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. He opened it, his thumb stroking the faded portraits of his wife and son. For 8 years this locket had been an anchor chaining him to his guilt. Now, knowing the truth, it felt different. It was still a vessel of sorrow, but it was no longer a token of his failure. It was simply a memory of a love he had lost. He knelt down and, using his knife, dug a small hole in the earth near the base of the stone chimney. He looked at the faces in the locket one last time, a silent goodbye passing his lips. Then he placed it in the hole and covered it with earth. Eliza had brought something with her, wrapped in a damp cloth. It was a small sapling, a cottonwood taken from the banks of the creek. Without a word, she knelt beside him and helped him plant it in the fresh earth over the buried locket. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was a promise of new life, a testament to the future, in a place defined by the past. As they worked, their hands brushed, and this time, neither of them pulled away. The resolution was not a sudden dramatic shift, but a slow, quiet healing. Jedediah stayed on at the ranch at the barn loft, no longer feeling like a temporary refuge, but like a part of a home. The rhythms of the farm, once a penance, now became a form of peace. He and Eliza found a new language in shared silences and easy companionship. The horrors they had faced together had forged a bond deeper than words, a love built not on grand declarations, but on mutual respect and a quiet, resilient hope. Months later, as autumn began to touch the valley with strokes of gold and crimson, they stood on the porch of the May cabin watching the sunset. The air was crisp and clean. Eliza leaned her head against Jedediah's shoulder, her hand resting on his arm. He placed his own hand over hers, his touch gentle. "The sapling we planted," she said softly, her voice filled with a peaceful certainty. "It's taken root. I rode out to see it yesterday. There are new leaves." Jedediah nodded, a small, genuine smile gracing his lips. For the first time in a very long time, life finds a way. She turned to him, and then her clear blue eyes shining with a light that held all the promise of a new dawn. She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "It does," she whispered. "It's found a way here, too." He felt the faint, subtle swell beneath her dress, a new life, a new beginning. A hope so powerful it finally truly silenced the ghosts of his past. He looked at her, at the home they now shared, at the future taking root within her, and knew that his long, painful search for redemption had at last come to an end. He was home.